One year after the rainy night that brought them together, Sarah stood in the newly renovated community clinic, watching as Mr. Rodriguez demonstrated his improved walking ability to a group of medical students. The clinic had become a model for community healthcare, with its cooperative structure drawing attention from healthcare providers across the country. "And this is where I first met my physical therapist, Miss Chen," Mr. Rodriguez was saying, his accent thick, but his voice strong. "She and that fancy boyfriend of hers saved our clinic, you know. But she still treats everyone the same, billionaires or bus drivers." Sarah smiled, remembering how James had sat with Mr. Rodriguez during his sessions, learning about his life as a Cuban immigrant while Sarah worked on his gait training. These days, it wasn't unusual to find the CEO of Morrison Medical Technologies sitting in the clinic's waiting room, laptop open, claiming the Wi-Fi was better than his office. The sound of familiar footsteps made her turn. James stood in the doorway, his tie slightly loosened after a day of board meetings. "Ready for dinner?" "Elena's saving our table at the restaurant." "Just finishing up," Sarah replied, gathering her notes. The past year had taught them both about balance, how to merge their worlds without losing themselves. James had learned to appreciate the small victories, like Mr. Rodriguez taking his first unassisted steps, while Sarah had grown comfortable in the corporate world, recently presenting their cooperative healthcare model at a national conference. As they walked to the restaurant, James slipped his hand into hers. "The foundation board approved the expansion program," he said. 10 more community clinics across the state will be implementing our cooperative model next year." Sarah squeezed his hand. "Our model," she corrected, "though I still can't believe you let me name it the Rainy Night Initiative." "Well, it's accurate," James chuckled, though the board did question why a healthcare program was named after weather conditions. They reached the small family-owned restaurant where they'd had their first real date. Elena, now the cooperative's financial director, waved from their usual table. The owner's daughter ran up to hug Sarah, showing off her healing knee after sports therapy. As they settled in, Sarah noticed James seemed slightly nervous, his hand repeatedly touching his jacket pocket. She had a pretty good idea why. She'd found the ring box in their shared apartment last week, but had pretended not to see it. Some surprises, she'd learned, were worth waiting for. "You know," James said, once Elena had left to take a phone call, "a year ago, I thought I had everything figured out. Success, status, the right solutions to every problem. And now?" Sarah asked, though she knew the answer in the way he looked at her. "Now I know that sometimes the best things in life come from taking the wrong turn on a rainy night," he smiled, reaching for his pocket. "And that the simplest gestures, like stopping to help a stranger, can lead to the most extraordinary journeys." Sarah felt her eyes fill with tears as James moved from his chair. Sometimes, she realized, fairy tales didn't need castles or knights in shining armor. Sometimes they just needed a rainy night, a caring heart, and the courage to see people for who they really are. The rehabilitation center's morning light filtered through large windows, casting warm rectangles across the exercise mats, where Sarah was helping James with his shoulder exercises. 2 weeks had passed since the accident, and she couldn't help but notice how different he was from her usual patients. While others complained about the repetitive movements, James approached each session with curiosity, asking questions about muscle groups and healing processes. "So the rotator cuff is actually 4 different muscles working together?" he asked, carefully completing another set of external rotations with the resistance band. "Exactly," Sarah replied, adjusting his form slightly. "Think of it like a team of workers, each with their own specific job, but all working toward the same goal." She noticed how he immediately related it to business principles, his mind always making connections. Between exercises, they fell into easy conversation. James shared stories about his company's early days, working from a garage with just 2 employees. Sarah talked about her patients, never by name, and the small victories that made her job worthwhile. The elderly man who could finally pick up his grandchild, the young athlete who returned to competition. "You know," James said during one session, rolling his shoulder experimentally, I've been thinking about what you said about the gaps in rehabilitation technology. What if we could develop something that provides real-time feedback on movement quality? Something more sophisticated than the current motion capture systems. Sarah's eyes lit up. That would be incredible for home exercise programs. So many patients struggle with proper form when they're not under direct supervision. She caught herself getting excited and added professionally, "But I'm sure your company has more important projects in development." James watched her carefully. "Actually, I'd value your input. You see things from the practical side that developers might miss." He hesitated, then added, "Maybe we could discuss it over coffee sometime. Strictly professionally, of course." Sarah felt her cheeks warm slightly. Over the past weeks, she'd found herself looking forward to their sessions more than she should. That would be appropriate, I suppose. As long as it's after you've completed your therapy course. Later that evening, Sarah sat in her office reviewing patient files. Her colleague, Marie, poked her head in. "Your tech entrepreneur was asking about our equipment suppliers today. Never had a patient so interested in the business side before." "He's just thorough," Sarah replied, trying to sound neutral. Marie smiled knowingly. "And I suppose it's just thoroughness that makes him schedule all these appointments when you're on shift." Sarah busied herself with her paperwork, but she couldn't help thinking about how James's eyes crinkled when he laughed, or how he remembered every detail she shared about her work. It was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain strictly professional thoughts about a man who quoted medical journals and rehabilitation studies during therapy sessions. Just to see her face light up with shared enthusiasm. Just 3 more sessions, she reminded herself firmly. But even as she said it, she knew their story wasn't going to end with his discharge papers. The steady beeping of hospital monitors filled room 412 as James Morrison slowly opened his eyes. Sunlight streamed through half-drawn blinds, casting linear shadows across the sterile white sheets. His head throbbed with each heartbeat, and the events of the previous night came back in fragmented pieces. Rain, a deer, the sudden terror of losing control. A young resident stood at the foot of his bed, reviewing his chart. "Mr. Morrison, glad to see you're awake. I'm Dr. Patel. You've got a concussion and some minor contusions, but you're quite fortunate. If it hadn't been for the quick action of the woman who found you." James tried to sit up, wincing at the movement. "Someone stopped to help." "Sarah Chen," Dr. Patel replied, adjusting James's IV drip. "She's actually a physical therapist at our rehabilitation center. Stabilized your neck, kept you monitored until the ambulance arrived. She even called this morning to check on you." The name stirred something in James's memory, a gentle voice in the rain, a steady hand on his wrist. He was used to people rushing to help him, but usually only after they recognized him as the founder of Morrison Medical Technologies. This was different. Later that afternoon, a knock on his door interrupted his phone call with his concerned board of directors. Sarah Chen stood in the doorway, still in her work scrubs, holding a small paper bag. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, her practical ponytail and minimal makeup a stark contrast to the usual polished visitors he received. "I just finished my shift and wanted to see how you were doing." James quickly ended his call. "Please come in. You must be Sarah. I hear I owe you my thanks." "Anyone would have done the same," she replied, pulling up a chair. "I brought you some decent coffee from the cafe across the street. Hospital coffee is basically brown water." She paused, studying his face. "How's the head?" "Like I went 10 rounds with a heavyweight," he admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. "I'm James, by the way. James Morrison. I run a small tech company focused on medical devices." Sarah nodded, and James noticed how she didn't immediately reach for her phone to Google him, a refreshing change. That must be interesting work. Any focus on rehabilitation equipment. That's an area that could use some innovation. For the next 20 minutes, they discussed the gaps in current physical therapy technology. James found himself taking mental notes as Sarah described the real-world challenges her patients faced. Her passion was evident in the way she gestured, her eyes bright with conviction. "I should let you rest," she finally said, standing. "But if you're interested, I could show you some of the equipment we're using in the rehab center." Might give you ideas for your company. I'd like that, James replied, realizing he meant it. For the first time in years, someone was talking to him as just another person, not as a billionaire CEO or a potential investor. As Sarah left, James reached for his phone, then stopped himself. For once, he didn't want to run a background check or have his assistant send an elaborate thank you gift. Sometimes he thought, the simplest connections were the most valuable. The community center's meeting room buzzed with energy as Sarah finished presenting their proposal. Around the table sat an unlikely mix of people: clinic staff, local business owners, community leaders, and James, who had swapped his usual suit for a casual button-down that helped him blend in with the group. So, Sarah concluded, by establishing a community health cooperative, we can keep the clinic independent while ensuring its financial stability. Local businesses would receive healthcare benefits for their employees, and we'd maintain our sliding scale fees for individual patients. Murray raised her hand. But how do we fund the initial transition? The hospital is cutting us off in 6 weeks. Before James could speak, Sarah continued, we've secured a bridge grant. She glanced at James, who had spent weeks helping her navigate grant applications, rather than simply writing a check himself. It's enough to cover operations while we implement the cooperative structure. After the meeting, Mr. Rodriguez's daughter, Elena, approached them. My accounting firm could handle the cooperative's books at a reduced rate, she offered. Dad wouldn't let me pay him back for all you've done for him, but this way. James watched as Sarah hugged Elena, struck by how his girlfriend's approach had created not just a solution, but a stronger community. He thought about their late-night planning sessions, Sarah teaching him about community dynamics, while he helped her understand financial structures. Later, in Sarah's small apartment kitchen, they sorted through support pledges from the meeting. You know, James said, organizing papers with his newfound appreciation for small-scale operations, I've engineered billion-dollar mergers that were less complex than this cooperative structure. Sarah looked up from her laptop, having second thoughts about dating someone who makes things complicated. Actually, he replied, I was thinking about how much I've learned. In my world, everything's about scale and efficiency. But you've shown me that sometimes the most effective solution is also the most personal. He paused, then added, the grant committee was impressed by your presentation, by the way. Sarah smiled, remembering how James had coached her on public speaking, but insisted she make the presentation herself. We make a good team. Your business sense, my community connection. Your stubbornness, my resources, James teased. My practicality, your dreams, Sarah countered, then grew serious. Thank you for not just taking over when things got tough, for trusting that I knew what my community needed. James crossed the small kitchen to wrap his arms around her. Thank you for showing me that success isn't always measured in dollar signs. He glanced around her modest apartment, which she'd refused to leave despite their relationship. Though I still think your building's elevator is a death trap. True, Sarah laughed, but Mrs. Kim in 4B makes the best kimchi in the city, and she always saves me a jar. You can't get that in a luxury high-rise. Partners in all things? James asked softly. Sarah leaned back against him, surveying their evening's work. Partners in all things, she confirmed, even if you still don't know how to load a dishwasher properly. Sarah's lunch break routine usually involved a quick sandwich at her desk while catching up on medical journals. Today, she was scrolling through Healthcare Innovation Weekly, searching for new research on rehabilitation techniques, when a familiar face stopped her mid-bite. There was James, on the cover, in an impeccably tailored suit. The headline read, Morrison Medical Technology CEO announces revolutionary neural interface breakthrough. Her sandwich forgotten. Sarah read further, learning that the small tech company James had mentioned was actually a multi-billion-dollar corporation leading the medical technology industry. Her phone buzzed, a text from James asking if she was free for coffee that afternoon to discuss some equipment ideas. She stared at the message, her mind racing through every conversation they'd had. All those discussions about healthcare accessibility, her passionate rants about outdated equipment, her casual mentions of the clinic's budget struggles. Had she seemed naive to him? When James walked into the coffee shop that afternoon, Sarah was already there, the magazine open on the table between them. His steps faltered slightly when he saw it. "So," she said quietly, "Morrison Medical Technologies isn't exactly a small tech company." James sank into the chair across from her, his usual confidence wavering. "Sarah, I can explain." "Please do," she interrupted, keeping her voice level. "Because I've been trying to understand why someone who could afford any physical therapist in the country would choose a community rehabilitation center. Was this some kind of social experiment?" "No," he replied quickly, then paused, choosing his words carefully. "When I woke up in that hospital bed, you were the first person in years who talked to me like a normal human being. Not as a CEO, not as a potential investor, just me." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of genuine distress. "I know I should have told you sooner, but every time I thought about it, I worried everything would change." Sarah studied him, noting the tension in his shoulders, the same tension she'd helped him work through in therapy. "Did you think I'd treat you differently?" "Everyone does," he said simply. "Last year, I dated someone who spent our entire relationship trying to get funding for her friend's startup. Before that, it was someone who seemed more interested in being seen with me than being with me. When you showed me that outdated ultrasound machine in the clinic, you weren't hinting for a donation. You were genuinely passionate about helping your patients." "I'm still that same person," Sarah said. "But relationships, professional or otherwise, need trust to work. You knew everything about me, while I only knew what you chose to share." James leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Ask me anything. No more partial truths. I want you to know exactly who I am, including the parts that don't make the magazine covers." Sarah took a slow sip of her coffee, considering. "Okay," she finally said. "Let's start with why you were really driving alone in the rain that night." Sarah sat in the staff meeting, her stomach knotting as the clinic director delivered the news. Budget cuts from the parent hospital meant their rehabilitation center would close within 3 months, unless they could find alternative funding. Around her, her colleagues' faces reflected the same mix of shock and despair she felt. "What about our patients?" Marie asked, voicing everyone's primary concern. "Most of them can't afford private clinics." Sarah thought about Mr. Rodriguez, who'd been making incredible progress after his stroke, and Jenny, the teenage athlete recovering from ACL surgery. These weren't just cases. They were people who trusted them, who depended on them. Later that evening, in James's penthouse, she paced as she explained the situation. 3 months. How are we supposed to find funding in 3 months? James, who had been listening intently, reached for his phone. "I can have the paperwork drawn up tomorrow. Morrison Medical Technologies can acquire the clinic. Upgrade all the equipment." "No." Sarah's voice was quiet but firm. "What do you mean, no?" James set his phone down, genuinely puzzled. "Sarah, I have the resources to solve this problem instantly." "And then what?" She turned to face him. "Every decision would go through your company. Every piece of equipment would be Morrison Tech. Every success story would be about how the billionaire CEO saved the little community clinic." She ran her hands through her hair in frustration. "Don't you see? It wouldn't be our clinic anymore. As opposed to not being the clinic at all." James's voice rose slightly. "I'm trying to help, Sarah. This is what I do. I see problems, and I solve them." "With money," Sarah said. "You solve everything with money, James. But some things need more than just a quick financial fix." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words. Finally, James spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "Then help me understand. What am I missing here?" Sarah sank onto the couch, suddenly exhausted. "Our clinic works because we know our community. We understand their needs, their limitations, their pride. Mr. Rodriguez walks an extra mile to get to us because he says it helps his recovery. But I know it's because he can't afford the bus fare. So we schedule his appointments for when his daughter can drive him, and we never mention knowing why." She looked up at James, willing him to understand. "If we become just another corporate healthcare facility, we lose that connection. We lose the flexibility to bend rules when needed, to treat people as individuals rather than profit centers." James sat beside her, not touching but close. You really think I'd let that happen? I think, Sarah said gently, that you're used to being the hero, to swooping in with grand solutions. But sometimes the people you're trying to save need to be part of finding their own solution. The city lights twinkled beyond the penthouse windows as they sat in thoughtful silence. Finally, James spoke. Okay, no acquisition, but what if we work together to find another way? Not as CEO and employee, but as partners. Sarah turned to look at him, seeing not the billionaire businessman, but the man who kept questioning her about patient care even after his own therapy was done. Partners, she repeated softly. I think I'd like that. The annual Children's Hospital benefit should have been like any other charity event for James, but tonight felt different. Sarah stood before the mirror in their hotel suite, adjusting the simple black dress she'd chosen for the evening. He watched her twist her hair up, then let it fall again, indecision evident in every movement. You look beautiful, he said softly. You don't have to change anything. Easy for you to say, Sarah replied, meeting his eyes in the mirror. You've done this 1,000 times. I spent the last 3 years in scrubs and sneakers. She picked up her phone, showing him the latest article, Morrison's Mystery Woman. Who is the CEO's new romance? The photo showed them leaving a restaurant last week. Sarah's face caught in mid-laugh at something James had said. We could skip it, James offered, though they both knew they couldn't. The benefit was raising money for new pediatric rehabilitation equipment, a cause they both cared deeply about. Sarah squared her shoulders, a gesture James recognized from their therapy sessions. No, this is important. I just wish, she trailed off, then started again. I wish I could be sure that when people look at me tonight, they're seeing Sarah Chen, physical therapist, and not just Morrison's mystery woman. James crossed the room to stand behind her, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. You know what I see? The woman who stopped to help a stranger in the rain. The professional who wouldn't let me get away with half effort during therapy. The person who called me out on my lies and then gave me a chance to tell the truth. The event itself was a swirl of cameras, handshakes, and introductions. James watched with pride as Sarah engaged with a leading urologist about innovative therapy techniques, her initial nervousness forgotten in the passion of discussion. Yet he also noticed her tense slightly each time a camera flashed, saw the way she carefully monitored every sip of champagne, aware of the scrutiny. Later, as they swayed together during a quiet moment on the dance floor, Sarah murmured, Your board member, Mrs. Hamilton, asked me if I had a good investment advisor yet. And what did you say? I told her I was more interested in investing in my patients' futures than my stock portfolio. She looked up at him uncertainly. Was that too? That was perfectly you, he interrupted, his hand tightening slightly on her waist. And that's exactly why I low. He caught himself, the word hanging unspoken between them. Sarah's steps faltered for just a moment, then resumed. You know, she said carefully, for a tech genius, you're terrible at hiding your feelings. Maybe I'm tired of hiding them, he replied, and in the gentle smile that spread across her face, he saw all the reassurance he needed. As the music drew to a close, Sarah whispered, For the record, I love you too. Even if you are terrible at keeping a low profile. The late October rain fell in steady sheets across the winding roads of Milton Heights, catching the glow of streetlights and transforming them into scattered diamonds against the darkening sky. Sarah Chen flexed her fingers against the steering wheel of her weathered Honda Civic, fighting the fatigue that always followed a double shift at the rehabilitation center. At 26, she had already learned that physical therapy was as much about emotional endurance as it was about medical knowledge. The digital clock on her dashboard read 7:42 p.m. when she rounded the bend that led past Morrison Industrial Park. Her mind wandered to the leftover Thai food waiting in her fridge and the stack of patient reports she still needed to review before tomorrow's sessions. That's when she saw it, the flash of brake lights ahead, followed by the sharp swerve of a sleek Tesla Model S. Time seemed to slow as she watched the luxury vehicle's desperate dance with physics. A large buck stood frozen in the road, its eyes reflecting the car's headlights. The Tesla's driver attempted to avoid the deer, but the wet pavement had other plans. The car fishtailed, spinning almost gracefully before slamming hard into the guardrail, with a sound that Sarah would remember for months to come. Without conscious thought, Sarah's training kicked in. She pulled her Civic onto the shoulder, hazard lights blinking to life with a quick push of a button. Her phone was already in her hand as she sprinted toward the wreckage, her sensible work shoes splashing through puddles. The rain plastered her dark hair to her face, but she barely noticed. "Sir, can you hear me?" she called out, approaching the driver's side. The airbags had deployed, and through the spiderweb glass, she could see a man slumped forward, unresponsive but breathing. The door handle yielded to her pull, a small mercy. Years of transferring patients had taught Sarah proper body mechanics. She stabilized the man's neck, noting the steady pulse beneath her fingers. He was well dressed in what she guessed was an expensive suit, though it was hard to tell in the rain and growing darkness. A small cut above his eyebrow bled freely, but it was the way his pupils responded slavishly to her pen mic that concerned her most. "This is 911. What's your emergency?" The operator's voice crackled through her phone speaker. Sarah's response was calm and methodical, born from years of medical training. "Single vehicle accident on Riverside Drive, just past Morrison Industrial Park. One victim, male, mid-30s, unconscious but breathing. Possible concussion. No obvious signs of spinal injury. I'm a physical therapist, staying with the victim until emergency services arrive." As she waited for help to arrive, Sarah kept one hand on the man's wrist, monitoring his pulse while using her body to shield him from the rain. She spoke to him continuously, her voice steady and reassuring, even though he couldn't hear her. In the distance, sirens began their urgent wail, growing louder with each passing moment. "Stay with me," she murmured, watching his chest rise and fall with shallow but regular breaths. "Help is coming. You're going to be okay."